Chapter 4. The next morning, the four of them took breakfast together. While it was quite normal for travelers to have a meal before setting out for the day, for Elsa, it was a wild luxury. As a compromise, they ate dark rye bread and a few beans to slate their thirst. She permitted some watery wine. Now then, about what we'll do next, started Lawrence, and everyone's gaze focused on him save Hollow. We'll make preparations today and tomorrow, and so leave the day after tomorrow at the earliest. Today, I'll go first to Mr. Phylon's place and work some details out with him and Mr. Roy. Cole nodded to prove that he was listening, and Lawrence directed his next words to Elsa. It would be good if you came along too, Miss Elsa, and talked about your plans for what's to come. Elsa cut even the hard rye bread up, rather than tearing into it, and brought bites politely to her mouth without dropping a single crumb. She treated it as though it were some sort of ritual practice in the concentration of her mind, but amazingly, she had no trouble listening to the conversation around her as she did so. Very well. I need to send a letter to the village as well, so I'll ask their help in that. Lawrence nodded and turned to Hollow, who, like a child, was tossing beans up one by one into the air and catching them in her mouth. And what will you do? Hollow had just tossed aloft another bean, and her fangs showed as she opened her mouth to catch it. Her gaze moved from the bean to Lawrence, but moments later the bean still landed perfectly in her mouth. She chewed it up, crunching, and washed it down with a thin whine. So long as you don't mind me creating new legends about a giant wolf, I've nothing much else to do. Now that she knew the direction and location, it would be safer and faster for Hollow to travel as a wolf. There was no reason for her to go all the way over to Phylon's to hear the conditions on the human road. So long as you don't mind me speaking as though I know the truth of the legend, said Elsa. Smiling with only her mouth, she returned to her meal, earning a wrinkled nose from Hollow. Lawrence sighed and looked over at the table, whereupon was neatly spread the map. So 'twould be boring to stay here alone. Then it's settled. Thereafter, each of them finished their breakfast. Elsa cleared her throat and began to teach Cole about some finger point of scripture. Hollow tended to her tail, grooming, and Lawrence decided he might as well trim his beard while he was in town. There would likely be trouble upon arriving in Chpt, and difficulty preparations in the meantime. In light of that, the quiet serenity of the water well in the inn's courtyard lit by the morning sun was a precious thing indeed. The far-off sounds of the busy town gave the quiet and different feeling than the silence of a forest or field. Lawrence had loved this quiet when he had traveled alone, and had come to appreciate it even more since then time had ended. When he had been able to continue on like this, he smiled a self-reproaching smile at the thought he would probably abide. He would have to. And anyway, as he told himself before, this was not their final parting. His worry was purely of his own creation. Well then, he brushed his hand free of crumbs. The day had begun. Lawrence had assumed that a shop catering to mercenaries would most likely idle in the morning. But he was mistaken. While the mercenaries themselves were certainly snoring loudly away in their wagon beds, the men around them were hurriedly buying up supplies. By the and manner of speaking, Lawrence at first took them as musicians, but apparently they were merchants who had spent their entire lives running their shops on the world's battlefields. Their cheerful demeanor come from their having long ago lost any fear of death whatsoever. Today I've only got one more troop coming by. When things are bad, it'll be 10 or 20 in a single day, said Phylon, shamelessly draining the contents of a cup that had been left on the table. When the merchants had left, it was terribly quiet, like a storm had passed through the shop. So many mercenaries come through, asked Lawrence, surprised, and this general store owner chuckled knowingly. The bills are always made out of some big lord somewhere. If you're well known and have a lot of territory, you can turn a hefty profit buying in one place and selling it off elsewhere. It seemed likely that Philon had taken advantage of the situation in Lenos and done some speculation himself, but Lawrence said nothing. No matter who was making what profit, as long as things were moving, there was no problem. So then, what can I do for my extended family here? The map from Miss Fran has arrived, said Lawrence, and Philon's face lit up with excitement that was obvious even in the dim shop. Oh, that's wonderful. He held out his hand in anticipation of Lawrence giving it to him, but Lawrence had very purposely not brought it with him. In the silence that fell over Philon's own, Hollow chuckled. So about the Tolkien group, region. There's a nice place, said Philon, sitting in a chair he produced from somewhere and taking up a quill pen. Bit large, though, even on the map. Yuitsu had only been one small part of Tolkien, but once she made it through into the region, Hello sense the smell would surely lead her to the rest of the way. There was a little village there, less a village, really, than a group of shelters for woodsmen and hunters to stay in. And the name? It was Hollow who asked. Elsa and Nicole were gazing at the swords on the walls and the parchment bundles on the shelves with intense interest, respectively, but simultaneously looked over at Hollow when she spoke. It didn't have a name. Isn't really the kind of place you give a name. Did someone tell you they were born in Tolkien? Yuitsu. Hollow was about to reply, but after a moment's movement of her lips, she said nothing and merely nodded. For people from around here, the name Tolkien doesn't mean much more than deep forests and mountains. Whoever it was ought to be proud they were born in such grand wilderness, I'd say. Philon's tone was light, as though trying to emphasize that it was not worth digging too deeply over. But far from relaxing, Hollow's face became even more sharper. Are the forests and mountains there yet bountiful? She spoke slowly and distinctly, as though emphasizing each word. Philon tapped his quill pen in his opened ledger, then rested his chin in his palm and regarded Hollow. Absurdly so, the word is that the deer are huge, and wolves? Wolves? Hollow looked intently at Philon. The silence that followed was unnerving for those who knew her true form. Philon suddenly looked up at the ceiling, drawing Lawrence's gaze with it. The area is thick with fierce wolves. Hollow drew a long breath, and her small body grew larger with it. If Lawrence had dared to point out that she seemed about to cry, she would have surely denied it with fangs bared. Many of the mercenaries imagined themselves to be descended from wolves, and if you did have an ancestor among the wolves of Tolkien, I'm sure it would have made you braver on the battlefield. If a human was the child of something other than a human, it had to be God. Thus was the teaching that the church spread. And even though Elsa was right there, Philon was speaking of such things as if it were common knowledge. Elsa made no indication of any concern. A man who made it his business to trade with mercenaries would have a keen grasp of what different sorts of people held dear. Are you? Began Philon, but then suddenly stopped. If she was born in the north, but had come from the south with her birthplace unknown, then the chance that the secret of her birth was a happy one is exceedingly low. He must have realized that. In any case, you're heading to Chpt, yes? Or will some of you remain here, or maybe make for Tolkien? We plan to go to Chpt. Would you tell us the way to go? From here? Unless you think we'd be better served by asking once we arrive in Chpt. Philon waved his hand to suggest that would not be necessary. He then closed his eyes, scratched his chin with his quill pen, and spoke. Between Chpt and Tolkien region, there's a path called the Fur Road. It's a common enough name, but it's the most important and profitable path for the fur trade in the area. It ought to be passable so long as it's not snowed in. On the way, you'll probably run into the territory of the Burner mercenary band. I'll write you an introduction letter. If anything happens, you'll never find a more reliable band. There's no way to tell whether Phylan suddenly had sympathy for Hollow's birth circumstances, or was trying to butter Lawrence up in order to look at Fran's map. It was probably both, but there was no reason to refuse such a letter. "My thanks," said Lawrence. Since Hollow seemed at a loss for words, what had been merely old memories and tales had accumulated and finally become a map. Now that it had a form, the rest was so simple. The path to Yoitsu was becoming clearer and clearer. Lawrence patted Hollow's back the way he would if she had a bite of food stuck in her throat. "And the two there? One was from Pinu, as I recall." Phylan pointed out at Elsa and Cole with his quill pen. Cole was completely incoherent, but Elsa was not the least concerned. "No, I have business with Leroy," she said in a cold, unwavering tone, straightened her posture. Phylan blinked in surprise, then made a great show of clearing his throat before speaking again. "I'm quite confident that anything he can do, I can do as well." "Is that so? In that case, I'd like to send a letter." Phylan seemed rather taken aback by Elsa's lack of either surprise or levity, but he managed a feeble certainly, at which Elsa finally smiled, a bit of loss herself. It seemed she had mastered an entirely different way of controlling men than Hollow had. It was hard to say which was better. "I've pen and paper. If you can write, I'm happy to take your dictation." "That won't be necessary, but I'm sorry to say I have no money." Phylan again thrust his chest out in the face of her straightforward admission. Yet he could not back out now. "I'll send the bill for the paper to Leroy. That's no problem at all." Elsa looked evenly at Phylan for a few moments. Then she gave a slow smile and said, "If you please." Phylan feigned ignorance at Leroy, who was running around making preparations for the journey. In fact, on the other side of the ceiling sat a mountain of goods, but he had not the slightest intention of parting with any of them. While Elsa wrote her letter, Phylan began tending on his own work, so Lawrence and the rest left the shop to bask in the sun. There were still many people walking by, and it was certainly never boring. "Once you find something, everything else becomes so clear," said Lawrence. Perhaps Cole was being considerate of the two since he crossed the street to peer into the cobbler's workshop. He was about the age to be handling minor tasks in the workshop or trading company after all. Just a moment earlier, the master of the shop had returned and smacked him on the head, evidently mistaking him for a lazy apprentice before Cole had hastily pointed out at Lawrence and Hollow. "Aye, now that we know our destination, all that's left is to point ourselves there and put one foot in front of the other." They watched Cole sit on the stone steps and relax, propping his elbows on his knees. He seemed sleepy, probably because the rays of the sun were warm. "Simple and clear," said Lawrence. Hollow closed her eyes and chuckled through her nose. Nothing to hesitate over. Her clear profile was as smooth as just a shelled white of a boiled egg. And the problems and troubles that had tangled up with one another in her mind seemed to have been swept away, leaving it clean. It seemed Lawrence really was the only one worried about the business of whether or not they would go to Yoitsu together. He sighed and a tired sigh to hide his frustration, then straightened and stretched. "Still relaxing in town. Like, this makes one reluctant to start traveling again." "Still relaxing in town like this makes one reluctant to start traveling again," he said. Looking up and squinting, Hollow too looked up, opening one eye just slightly and glancing aside at Lawrence. "With that reasoning, I'd have to give it serious thought. It was too much trouble to quarrel." So Lawrence shrugged and ignored her baiting. A goodly amount of time had passed when Elsa finished writing her letter. As logical as she was when speaking, when it came to time to collect her thoughts on paper, she evidently found her more and more difficult. She had ink on her face and hands, and she seemed somewhat hollowed out by the task. Where did they go? I gave them a few coppers and they went off to the docks. Would you like to go as well, Miss Elsa? Elsa shook her head, wordlessly. When Lawrence thought about it, he realized that, having lived in such a small village, she had probably never had much cause to put her thoughts into written words. Just figuring out how to address Evan had probably taken a good amount of time. Lawrence considered this as his gaze swept the room. Where did Mr. Fryland go? Elsa asked. No idea. I seem to remember him standing up from the table, but Lawrence looked and saw that the door to the courtyard was partially open, and some of the light from the outside was doing its best to enter the gloomy workshop. Even if Elsa was a clergywoman, it was careless of Phylon to leave the shop open with a stranger inside, or perhaps there was simply nothing to steal. The ultimate merchant could run a shop with nothing on but credit. And with nothing but credit, there would be nothing to steal. Seems like we ought not to leave, then, said Lawrence. Yes, that's true, but, Yes, Lawrence asked, at which Elsa's face suddenly looked utterly exhausted. Her tone turned apologetic. Might I go outside to take some fresh air? Lawrence smiled and watched her go. The door closed with a thunk, and Lawrence was alone in the dim shop. He sat in the chair and once more looked slowly about the place. It was not small, but neither was it spacious. There was little in the way of decoration, but no space was wasted. The table, chairs, and shelves were purely functional, and there were exactly as many of each as was necessary. It was well cleaned, but not ostentatiously polished. Nowhere was there too much of anything nor too little. It was a very relaxed space. Lawrence took a deep breath through his nose and exhaled through his mouth. The shop was quite quiet, ideal for relaxation, and although if such a shop were his, he would need to add a window, Lawrence mused. There would need to be a sunlit place for Hollow to groom her tail, after all. As he thought more on it, Lawrence waved his hand to clear his mind of the daydream. They were becoming more frequent as the days passed, and more specific, too. There was not anything wrong with that, per se, but it was something he had to hide so long as he traveled with Hollow. Even if she had not been a wise wolf, he had to shut away the words deep in his heart. Let's open a shop together. Chpt, eh? He murmured with a smile. If Hollow was not going to keep the promise, then Lawrence had no right to object. The resolve was hers. Everyone else was merely cooperation. He would do everything he could to help her. Lawrence had never traveled to Chpt, but he had heard of the place. It was a well-to-do town, atop a hill among the rolling plains. He had heard the town was filled with greenery. There were even some who spoke of it as though it were a town swallowed by forest. It would surely be a good place to show Hollow and Co. As far as Elsa went, she had been born in a village with an excellent view, so she might find Chpt rather confining. In any case, it seemed like a nice place, which was a relief, and being relatively close to the capital city of Edima, the wine and food ought to be good. It would be a good place for goodbyes. Lawrence rested his cheek in his hand and spoke words aloud. A good place for goodbyes. He was normally stubborn, but he wondered if that wasn't part of his charm. Why had Hollow so easily given up on their promise? Or was the idea of ending their wonderful travels in sight of Yuitsu just too ridiculously sentimental, just as she said? Or was it the only one who thought so much of what the other was thinking? In his memories, Hollow smiled. The smile was directed at someone he did not know. It was unfair, reactionary thought. And then, has the Holy Sister finished her writing? Finally entered the shop, pushing the half door open, from the courtyard all the way open. She seemed to be having quite a bit of trouble with it. That's not such a bad thing, he spoke so plainly that Lawrence found himself staring at Phylon, finding him quite a mystery. This man who dealt with mercenaries wore a boyishly mischievous expression. I can't imagine there are many happy people who are well accustomed to writing letters to their loved ones, wouldn't you say? These were the words of a man who was living his life with his eyes open. Lawrence smiled to hide his vexation and sighed. True enough. You want to be close to the people you love. Fräulein nodded, satisfied, and sat himself down in a chair. On the table was a letter that Elsa had handwritten. Fräulein picked it up and looked it over. He was not reading it, it seemed, but rather checking to see if the ink had dried. So I couldn't help but be a little interested, began Fräulein as he folded up the letter. He spoke as though he had been having a conversation with Lawrence about something in particular right up until that moment. Lawrence was briefly confused. He flipped back through his memories, trying to guess at what Fräulein was talking about, but Fräulein himself cut Lawrence's musing short. So I went and talked to the link company myself. Fräulein had claimed to Leroy that he could not be seen getting involved with the Link Company. Had that been merely an excuse to turn him down? Lawrence considered that, then revised his thinking. What if it was not that, but rather that there was now some larger reason that justified the risk of contact? Anyhow, it turns out I got a hit. A hit? It was a strange word to use. It implied a sort of good fortune, but depending on the context, the meaning could change quite dramatically. A glance at Fräulein's face revealed that whatever it was no good. My company supplies mercenary troops, and I act as sort of an agent for them at times as well. The Link Company is the opposite. There was nothing in my ledger about any mercenaries heading for Tolkien, so I thought there might be in theirs. He fingered the letter pointlessly. Even if a troop winds up taking prisoners of war, depending on where it happens, they'll be turned away at the gates. So when there's a rumor of war, they'll talk to the companies ahead of time. Meaning? Lawrence replied, worried. It might have been that Fräulein had been testing whether Lawrence would turn worried or not. His eyes were full of sympathy, meaning that in all likelihood there's going to be a battle for control of the Tolkien region. Fräulein had come right out and said it in this moment because he had been worried there would not be another chance. No doubt if he was a considerate man, he would not have desired to deliver such news in front of a girl like Hollow. Lawrence was the same way, so there was nothing to smile about. But now that he knew, that meant he would have to be the one to tell Hollow. Unfairly, he wanted to quarrel with Fräulein on those grounds alone. But I have no idea what the goal is. It's just a thick forest, an endless mountain steep. There are barely any villages worth naming, or maybe they're thinking that that's the perfect place to source slaves. Or else Fräulein's gaze was far away. They struck a load of ore. He had told Hollow that the mountains and forests of Tolkien were bountiful, given the prospect of self that Roy had convinced Lawrence to aid him with, anyone could have guessed what they were most concerned with. A bitter taste filled Lawrence's mouth, but still, it was only one possibility. Fräulein seemed to be thinking the same thing. Of course, it might be overthinking things. I might be overthinking things. All that the Link Company said was that they'd received word from a mercenary group that they might be bringing prisoners down from Tolkien. If a rich lode had been discovered, the scale of operation would expand considerably. There would certainly be at least one mercenary troop willing to venture forth to a remote location to fight for nothing but money. That was the simple fact of it. Somebody would be unlucky, of course, but Lawrence was honestly relieved. He did not think about whether or not that went against the teachings of God. Holla would be going to Uitu alone. He wanted her to encounter as little difficulty as possible. A masochistic smile rose to his face at his own selfishness. Then, come to think of it, I think the mercenary troop in question has a wolf on its standard. A wolf? Phylon nodded and tapped at his temple with his finger. It had a rather strange name. It's not a big troop, but it's been around for a long time. What was it? He took a moment to dust off the memories before the right one fell to his lips. The Miyuri mercenary band. Holo had friends in her homeland. Lawrence had not forgotten their names. Yue, Inti, Pado, strange names like ciphers for something, and there was a last name that Holo had murmured, Miyuri. They're a small band, but I've heard they're well-disciplined. Their leader's especially clever, it's said. I've never supplied them, though, so I only know the name. Lawrence breathed in slowly as Phylon explained, and when it was finished he exhaled a long breath. It was said that over the countless months and years the Fanged Ones had dedicated themselves to battle, but finally lost and become part of the earth. Many died during the battle with the moon-hunting bear, and the rest died fighting humans in the aftermath. This was the story that Hughes had told them in Career Bay. Holo had made herself accept that there was no trace of the wolves that had once lived in Yuitsu, nor of their battles. But now, as though fate were not such a cruel god after all, it seemed the wolves of Yuitsu had not been so weak. A mercenary band, flying the standard of the wolf, calling themselves Yuri, and making camp near Yuitsu. This could not be mere coincidence. The simplest explanation was that Holo's friend Miyuri was still alive, and having heard of the Debriel Company's schemes, gone to occupy the homeland. Lawrence could not imagine better news. Anyway, I thought this might worry your company, or your companion. Shall I try to find more information? Lawrence shook his head. The Miyuri mercenaries were encamped in the region of Yuitsu. Just informing Holo of that simple fact would be more than enough. He could so easily imagine her face at the loss for words out of sheer happiness. Being the bearer of good tidings was always a popular job. Lawrence wanted to tell her as soon as he possibly could, and yet he realized that just as much as he did not want to tell her at all. Because upon hearing of Miyuri, Holo would surely be overjoyed. She would suppress her desire to go see for a time and go with him to Kishin. But after she left Lawrence and company, she would cast her human form aside and immediately make for Yuitsu. Lawrence would have to watch her go. He would have to imagine her reunion with them from afar. Alone in the driver's seat of his wagon, there was no way he could be present for the moment. Once she had reunited with Miyuri and had that moment of joy, would she talk about all the things she had done, the times she had been saved by a human? If Miyuri did not hate humans, would Miyuri be glad to hear the tale? Lawrence did not want to imagine what would happen next. Mercenary bands never named themselves after women. Even if Holo and Miyuri had not been lovers, he was still a wolf from her homeland, one whom she had thought long dead. Before the two giant wolves there would be his insignificant copper-pinching self, and it was obvious to Lawrence how ridiculous he would feel. That was no place for him. He was not optimistic enough to think so. He wanted to raise his arms and shout, "Huzzah!" At least the journey had been fun. He could only smile at that. So Lawrence did smile and spoke. The world does not always go as one would wish. Phylon fixed Lawrence in his gaze. "You're right about that," he murmured with a sigh. Perhaps the outside air had helped ease Elsa's fatigue, for when she returned to the shop, her usual dignified air had returned. She was not the type to eavesdrop, so she had undoubtedly not heard Phylon and Lawrence's conversation, but she still seemed to sense a subtle change in the atmosphere of the shop. She looked at Lawrence with questioning eyes, but Lawrence pretended not to notice. A confession like that was not something given easily, but if there was an answer to the question as to when to tell Holo about Miyuri, asking God might not be such a bad idea, he thought. If he told Holo as soon as she returned, her mind would surely be filled with thoughts of him. And even if it was not, it would certainly be a source of unease for her. After all, Hollow had herself had said she would go with them to Christian, and their part ways. She could not very well just head off on her own for Yuitsu just because she learned about Miuri mercenaries. No, Christian would be the place to tell her when they were about to part, Lawrence thought. He really did not have much time left with her. As shameful as he found his selfish thoughts, he wanted her attention to be on the travel that still lay before them. The problem was whether he could hide that from Hollow. It was probably impossible. But when he considered the question of whether or not she would try to pry it out of him, when she noticed he was hiding something, the answer seemed to be in the negative. Regardless of how she had been in the past, the Hollow of right now might well notice him hiding something, but she would keep silent. And when they parted ways and Lawrence told her about Miuri, she would ask why he had hidden that from her, and she would laugh and laugh. As any merchant would, Lawrence was making the most effective, profitable plan he could. It seemed sincerely loving someone made one's thinking faster, but turned it into the most ridiculous directions. It had been an interesting experience, but it might be well to have this be the last, Lawrence mused. And it was as he smiled, a self-reproaching smile, and heaved a heavy sigh that the party returned. "Come, we've brought gifts," came the loud, cheerful words as the door opened with a slam. Those within the shop had become used to the quiet, so the shock was all the more jarring. In the brief moment of time it took to look up and wonder what the matter was, Cole followed Hollow in and sat a shallow bucket filled with water on the floor. His breathing was ragged, and he sat down on the floor right there on the spot, exhausted. The bucket had obviously been heavy for Cole's small frame, and ignoring Lawrence's sympathy for the lad, Hollow stood there, her chest thrown out proudly. "Look, we found today's lunch," said Hollow, whose cheeks were also red and shiny with sweat. Lawrence approached, wondering what it could be, when his nose was assaulted by a pungent smell, its source very soon clear. Within Cole's bucket swam a number of dark eels. "Magnificent, aren't they?" "We were wandering around the docks when we came upon some fool who tipped over a great barrel. Inside were all these eels, and they were scattered around like wind-blown soot." The exhausted Cole was unable to get to his feet, so Elsa, worried, crouched down beside him to check on him. Meanwhile, Hollow smiled triumphantly. She smelled bad, and her sleeves were damp. "Don't tell me you stole these." "Fool! We were asked to help catch them, and this is our reward. I was the best at catching them, wasn't I?" Prodded by Hollow's question, Cole smiled a weak smile. Farland came over as well and peered inside the bucket. They were fine eels, big and fat. "Well, still, you ought to change your clothes," said Lawrence. "Oh, I am a bit damp." "Well, I'll leave the preparation to you. Come, Cole," Hollow chattered away. And Cole, having finally caught his breath, managed to stand. Given his exhausted state, anyone watching would have wanted to stop him. But the one who actually did was neither Elsa nor Lawrence. He laughed a boisterous, infectious laugh. Head back and hands on his hips, no actor in a town square could manage such a performance as Farland did naturally in that moment. "Goodness, but you're an amusing guest indeed. Don't worry, we'll make ready some hot water and handle the preparation." "Really? If you walk around outside like that, you'll catch a cold. I'll have the lads heat a bath. As far as a change of clothes go," said Phylon, thinking, at which point Lawrence got some words in. "I can get a change of clothes from the inn." "Oh, well, let's do that, then. In the meantime, we'll deal with these eels. They'll make for an unexpectedly grand lunch." Lawrence wondered for a moment if, in taking a bath here at the shop, Hollow would let her ears or tail be seen, but doubted that Hollow would let such a thing happen. Elsa had helped Cole to his feet, but Hollow grabbed his hands and pulled him after her as she followed Phylon further into the shop. Lawrence watched her go and sighed helplessly. He felt foolish for worrying so much about so many things. Hollow had burned his broom along the a gloom has burned his gloom away with a brightness that no gold coin could match. Lawrence scratched his head and looked down into the bucket of eels, a small smile on his face. "Well then, I'm off to the inn," he said to Elsa, who was watching Cole's bucket with concern. What stopped him just short of leaving the building was not a reply from her, but rather a statement. "I'm coming too," she said. Just as an eel splashed noisily in the water, she flinched away from it as though avoiding dangerous animal, and came alongside Lawrence, keeping a wide berth from the bucket. She seemed rather scared of eels. "I have some spare clothes I can lend you," she said. "Oh," thought Lawrence to himself. He was no hollow, but he had a certain ability to see through people's lies. But there was no reason to point it out, so he simply nodded, and the two left the shop. Just as in any other town, the streets of Lemnos had names. Every lane, big or small, had wooden signs erected indicating that it was such and such street. Even the small alleys were well paved with cobblestones and had lovely wooden signs. Lawrence was admiring one as they passed when Elsa suddenly spoke up. "I have been thinking," she said. Almost as though talking to herself, after a pause, she continued, "Can I be of any use to you?" "Huh?" Lawrence thought he had misheard, but this time Elsa looked right at him and spoke very clear. "Can I be of any use to you? To all of you?" Her honey-colored eyes were as serious as ever. "Especially you. I know you don't want to go to Kishkin. Am I wrong?" Lawrence looked back into those big eyes. She smiled a thin smile and replied, "That's a surprising offer." He anticipated her anger, but Elsa's way of being angry was not what he expected. "It is not at all surprising." She looked steadily back at him. The street was crowded, and if she kept walking along while looking aside at him, she would have easily been run over by a wagon. Before replying, Lawrence pulled her out of the way as a cart rumbled by, taking no notice of the pedestrian traffic as it went. "It is surprising," said Lawrence, pulled close like this. Hullo would have pretended bashfulness or looked up at him winsomely. But Elsa did neither. Of course she would not, Lawrence admitted to himself, but he wondered if Evan the miller knew better and felt a moment of manly frustration. "I owe you a debt, you see," said Elsa. When the conversation at the end, Elsa seemed to have simply drawn some conclusion. The source of distress between Lawrence and Hullo was because they could not be in two places at once, but if Elsa could be in one of those places, she could help solve the problem. It seemed an oversimple childish idea, but more than that, it was a very clear Elsa-like proposal. However, even if the Dealing Company had not insisted on certain conditions, it would still not be a solution. No matter how optimistically Lawrence regarded her, Elsa was not suited for the combat of trade. "I'm very grateful that you would offer," said Lawrence with a smile. He did not give his reason for refusing because it was true that he was grateful. Despite all her quarreling with Hullo, Elsa showed no trace or hint of a grudge. Even merchants who would cooperate with their mother's worst enemy, if it were in their own interest, were rarely so magnanimous. "I see," said Elsa, nearly sighing her deep disappointment. "Might I ask why you offer?" Lawrence asked. Though it might have been a pointless question, Elsa's strong faith in the teachings of God might mean that helping others was simply a matter of course for her, but her merchant's intuition compelled him to ask anyway. His ears were even better than Hullo's when it came to sensing whether someone was being truly selfless. He guessed there might be a reason other than pure selfless kindness for Elsa to make such an offer. And just as he guessed, she replied without anger, "First, I've been turned away by the church here. Undoubtedly, the church in Lemnos had no time for people like Elsa." After the fur riots, before Lawrence could offer any word of comfort, Elsa made a troubled face and continued, "The second reason is that we're alike." "Alike?" Lawrence was surprised by this unexpected statement. Elsa nodded and turned her head to face him. "Our true feelings are obvious, yet we both insist on putting on such great facades of responsibility. She had the face of a great priest, one who could peer into another's heart, see the pain that lurked in there, and bring them comfort on its stead. Lawrence hastily averted his eyes. He had the feeling that everything inside him was being discovered through and through. I left my village with just that facade. I can't say I don't have experience with it, said Elsa. Then looked again ahead. Surprised, Lawrence regarded her profile, but finding a priest for your village is a proper reason, isn't it? It is, and yet Elsa seemed conflicted, but it was not in the girl's nature to remain indecisive. Mr. Lawrence. She looked up at him and said his name. Her face had a vulnerability to it she would never show him in the village of Teriel. It seemed as though she wanted to confess some sin that Lawrence was the only person she could tell. At the very least, as an older man, perhaps he could give her some perspective. There is something I should confess only to God. Lawrence met Elsa's pained gaze with a smile. Do not worry, I have every intention of reaching the kingdom of heaven, so I'll pass your message along. It was a good joke coming from a stingy merchant like him, and Elsa smiled a strange, exhausted smile. But as a joke, it seemed to have had its intended effect. Elsa turned forward and rubbed her face, then turned and looked down. She murmured a quick prayer before composing herself. The reason I am searching for a priest to take charge of the church in my village is because I do not wish to hold my position. Lawrence knew he could not betray surprise. A confessor's role was only to listen. He took breath and he prompted quietly, despite my position, I've had a faint wish. Elsa looked up, suddenly seemingly appropriately fragile for a girl her age. She seemed on the verge of tears, and her usual flush and spirited strength was nowhere to be seen. Elsa would never have shown this face to a stranger. The only other one who would have ever glimpsed it would have been Evan the miller. And as soon as the thought came to him, Lawrence realized the truth. She gripped tightly to the hand-carved seal that she wore about her neck. The seal given to her by someone close to her when she had left the village. If possible, my wish is to someday make Evan my... Lawrence did not allow her to continue further. He put his finger to her mouth and, with a sigh, spoke. You should speak of this rest of the sentence, not to me, but to him. The clergy were not allowed to marry. But if there was a church in a town, then someone had to be in its employ. Elsa had taken that duty all by herself, but it had never been her wish to remain alone. The facade and the truth, knowing Elsa had heard his conversation with Hollow, and then she realized how similar they were, made Lawrence feel too ashamed to look her in the eye. But if that's how you've always felt, trying to preserve his dignity as an older man in the conversation, Lawrence looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. After a span of time, Elsa seemed much calmed. It makes me very happy. Just the sentiment alone is enough. She looked at him with an expression that made Lawrence rue his own powerlessness. So he added something. We merchants are very harsh about borrowing and lending. We don't say such things lightly. A merchant would happily squeeze debt from a family member. Lawrence thought about saying so, but decided there was no need. Elsa nodded, as though forcing herself to accept his word, then smiled awkwardly. The bell signaling midday rang, a series of irregular strikes. Lawrence spoke only after the echo of the bell's toll had faded into the sky. Still, your relationship with him was rather obvious, I must say. Elsa looked up at Lawrence with eyes wide in surprise. Did you suppose that we were trying to hide it? That in itself was a surprise, as Lawrence's smile made it quite clear. But as Lawrence smiled beside him, Elsa cleared her throat. Lawrence looked, and it seemed as though she were brushing away the embarrassment of her confession, purposely resumed her serious face. So even if I cannot directly solve your problem, I am still clergy. If someone is hiding pain in their heart, I can at least listen to their troubles. After all, Elsa's expression hardened. I confessed my heart. She was a clumsy bargainer, but for the straightforward Elsa, it was a good try. And it was true. She had told him about Evan, and her desire to give solace to anyone suffering, and the gap between their heart and their facade was a sincere one. "You're right." Lawrence raised his hands in surrender. Elsa cleared her throat again. "To be blunt, the way you two act is unnatural." Having it thrown in his face so directly made Lawrence feel a touch irritated. "I'm a human and she's a wolf. There's nothing natural about it," he replied. Elsa drew a sharp breath at these words, but pressed on nonetheless. "That is not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Lawrence immediately replied. "Why should two lovers not hold hands?" Hearing this, Lawrence froze in his tracks, and not out of anger. He was shockingly embarrassed, and his hand came up to cover half his face. "I simply can't understand it. You say she's a wolf, but there are many such stories in the books my father left behind." So Lawrence held up his other hand in an attempt to get Elsa to stop. He was too humiliated to so much as look at her. He stared off into the distance, waiting for his pounding heart to slow down. Hollow had made fun of him for being girlish, but he was suddenly shocked to realize how pure and naive he truly was. "Pardon me," Lawrence managed with the last of his merchant's composure, and then he just stood there for a moment. For the first time, he knew the destructive power that words like two lovers could have when used outside of a poem. Now you see, Miss Elsa, that we live in here reality. Just as we cannot exist in two places at once, solving our problems is not so simple as joining hands. On that count, Hollow's reasoning for going with him to Chpt was perfect. It was so logical that any merchant the world over would applaud its correctness. If that's so, why won't you fight for it? You say that without having even tried. Lawrence himself did not know the nature of the verbal explosion he had just swallowed down, but his hand had reached out and grabbed Elsa's robe by the collar. "My apologies," he said, immediately coming to his senses and releasing her. Instead of affixing her collar, Elsa gave Lawrence a sharp glare. But her anger was not at his outburst, but rather that, despite the intensity of his words, he was still hiding his true feelings behind his own facade. "I have tried to fight." "Truly?" shot back Elsa. "Truly or not, that I don't know." Lawrence walked on, leaving the flustered Elsa aside, her face still a mask of disbelief. She trotted to catch up to him. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean exactly that. Of course I don't want to go with her to our original destination. Of course I want to go with her to our original destination. I want to go to her homeland, but the circumstances won't allow it. And the logical course of action is to do as she says. It's best for her, and it's best for me, and it's best for Cole." The words "the adult's decision" has a nice ring to them. Elsa seemed about to say something in response to Lawrence's remark, but in the end she stopped herself. She looked down, frustrated and pained. Lawrence himself thought he ought to go to Yoitsu with Hollow. No, not thought. Wished. But it was impossible to overturn Hollow's reasoning. If he did, it would be astonishingly selfish of him, and he could not imagine that Hollow would be pleased by his selfishness. Throwing everything recklessly away and getting a tidy happy ending only ever happened in stories. In reality, life had to continue. Hollow had spoke with a tired smile on her face. Living involved a lot of time. Life was too long to throw away everything just for one moment. Lawrence and Elsa walked wordlessly along, and finally the inn came into view. The first floor was filled with craftsmen taking their lunch, and travelers too. There were many faces, some happy, some not. Life has ups and downs. We're not a mere figure of speech, it was reality. Not everything went smoothly, and if one did not compromise somewhere, they would never get through. All heroes had to face many difficulties and countless dangers, but not everyone who faced difficulty and danger became a hero. Most of them just died along the way. Lawrence was a traveling merchant. No one would ever fault him for being extremely cautious, and cautious he was, and he ought to be. Lawrence quietly climbed the stairs. He heard no creaking floorboards, but given the small footfalls behind him, Elsa was following up. Seen from the outside, he was surely a pathetic sight, perhaps too pathetic to leave alone. But this was the way of the world. Lawrence allowed himself to feel at least a little self-pity as he murmured the words in his heart and smiled a sad, tired smile. "Can there not be a miracle?" Came Elsa's short-sopped words. "Can there not be a miracle?" she said again, as Lawrence looked over his shoulder. Elsa had stopped on the stairs, looking at Lawrence, who was about to round the landing. You and she came to our village and created a miracle which saved us all. Can you not?" Elsa swallowed her words and seemed to be holding back tears. "If a miracle cannot save you as well, then how can I go on teaching the word of God?" Her honey-colored eyes looked up at Lawrence, penetrating, but there was no trace of anything like hostility in them. Lawrence scratched his head and averted his eyes. Elsa was wholly and completely, from the bottom of her heart, a servant of God. "I know it's selfish of me to say so. I know that, but..." "No, you haven't said anything wrong or mistaken. It's simply that we, or at least I, am not a pure enough soul to be saved by a miracle," said Lawrence. Stepping down the stairs and crouching down in front of Elsa, he reached out and straightened the collar that his earlier violence had set askew. Elsa did not try to brush him away or show any sign of disgust. She merely watched him. It turns out that Yuri mercenaries are close to her homeland. Her face turned confused, as though wondering what he was getting at. Lawrence checked her left and right labels for evenness, then flattened them with a pat, at which Elsa did not so much as flinch. "Yuri, you see," he continued, "is the name of someone my companion separated from centuries ago in her homeland, someone she thought long dead." Lawrence had turned his back to her, so he did not know what happened next. But it seemed to Lawrence that her expression did not change very much. He's probably alive, though. She doesn't know yet. I'm going to tell her in Chpt when we part ways." "Why?" came the short demand from behind him. "Because I want her to concentrate on the journey with me until then. A mercenary band would name themselves after a woman. It's ridiculous, but I'm jealous. We've gotten this far. I may as well confess it." Lawrence put his hand out to the room's door and looked back at Elsa. "I wish that Yuri would have stayed dead. Horrible, aren't I?" He sighed and pushed the door open. He wanted to take a step inside and then slammed the door behind him. I should think that if miracles kept happening to a man like me, I would be a god whose word you couldn't spread." He began unpacking bags as he searched for a change of Hollow's clothes. Once she left, he would have to sell them, the expensive clothes she had demanded for. Behind him, Elsa too entered the room, and from her bag produced a set of clothes. "That is indeed awful of you. No doubt God will punish you." Her blunt words were somehow comforting. Lawrence stood, a smile still lingering on his face, and made ready to leave the room. But unexpectedly, Elsa's words followed him, and yet I still do not understand. Looking over her shoulder, he saw that she was plainly angry. "Feeling the way you do, yet trying to act rationally. I simply don't understand. That's what's unnatural. You should choose one or the other." "It is none of your business," said Lawrence flatly. He had added a troubled, complicated smile as a courtesy. "This is our problem and our decision. It is not your place to say what we should do, not even as a teacher of God's word." He added that last excuse, but it was just that, an excuse. Elsa had been speaking from her heart, as Lawrence was perfectly aware, but he could not let her go on. "You're quite right." Elsa took a deep breath and tears spilled from her eyes. "But I wanted to repay my debt to you both. It doesn't seem to me that either of you are acting in your own best interest, so I wanted to at least..." "Me, no, but she is, I assure you." Lawrence was the only one being stubborn about wanting to go to her with her to Yuitsu. Hollow wanted to do so, if possible, but only after considering other possibilities. That was the extent of it for her. Two lovers, Elsa had so shamelessly said, but the truth was much less clear. Lawrence found it easy to think of the words is a bit bitter irony, so the news about Miuri did nothing but put his heart at peace. But Elsa simply looked back at him. Her honey-colored eyes were noble and sharp, like the pommel jewels of a sword. And my question still stands. Why won't you turn back and fight? For a moment, Lawrence did not understand what he was hearing. It's like there are two Evans. Your indecision is so frustrating I could hardly stand it. Why won't you just act the way you feel and the way you honestly feel? Why are you convinced that swallowing down your own opinion is best for her? God is the friend of the righteous. You have nothing to fear. As Elsa went on, her voice rose, and with these last words her shoulders shook. The content of her ranting had a logic to it, but he was also incoherent. She herself seemed not to know exactly what she was going on about. She was probably just speaking her thoughts as they came to mind. But Lawrence understood what she meant all too well. At the very least, he understood the feelings that had welled up inside. But the most important thing was that Lawrence had taken all that, forced it underneath reason, and ascribed it to Hollow. For trying to act so wisely, it seemed he had been quite stupid. You're right about everything, said Lawrence in an exhausted tone. His words came out without a hint of deception. But I'm a simple merchant. So think, Elsa seemed to have forgotten why she herself was angry. Yet still she glared up at Lawrence, continuing her verbal assault. Don't pray, think. If you say you've turned away from God and deserve no miracles, then stop praying and think like a merchant. It was a strange entreaty for her to make. Elsa had nothing to gain from it, yet she was truly angry at Lawrence and Hollow. You merchants use all sorts of unbelievable techniques, don't you? You have the means available to you that can only be called magic, don't you? Or if you're hesitating to use such despicable methods, then be at ease. Elsa straightened and directed her unwavering gaze right at Lawrence. I will do all I can to assure their correctness in the face of God's teachings. This was where he should laugh her off, surely. If 100 merchants heard the story, then those 100 merchants and 20 of their friends would all agree that Hollow's way was the right one, while handling Elsa a glass of wine and telling her to calm down and have a drink. But Elsa's view was very attractive. She was telling him to think. Elsa herself was no fool. She was certainly smart enough to understand there was a certain logic to Hollow's way. But she was saying all of this because she could not stand to watch them go through with it. So at the very least, it was worth putting his head to work trying to find a way to respond to her with some kindness. She was, after all, offering to make excuses to God for whatever underhanded methods he might use. It would do to give the matter some thought, at least before giving up. He could not very well just turn suddenly defiant toward Hollow, but there was the possibility that he could claim some small business reason for him to go, and it was obvious what he could consider. He had to find a way to force that faraway company to sell the book without him going to Chpt, and without them learning the facts of the matter. Kidnap the company master's daughter or wife and threaten him. Put a curse upon him. Or hire a band of mercenaries. It was rather fun just thinking of such mad possibilities, but in truth, merchants did not possess the magical ability that Elsa had misunderstood them to possess. Even money orders, those mystical documents that let you move money without carrying heavy coin on your back, were not so mysterious once you understood how they worked. They were simply a way of moving goods down the invisible canal called credit. Money was not being magically transported. There was a principle to it. Even if one used credit backward, all they could steal was money, not life. Lawrence's thoughts got the care and were caught suddenly. Use credit backward? The word struck him as strange, and for a moment he realized his cognition had gone idle. Elsa looked at him curiously and was about to say something, but Lawrence stopped her with a raised hand. He suddenly He suddenly had the feeling there was something he had missed, as though there were keys to this problem scattered all over Lenos. Golden keys that would unlock the path for him to travel to YouTube with Hollow. The hope beat almost painfully in his heart, as the scenes he had witnessed since arriving in town flashed through his mind. Lawrence looked at Elsa. Elsa, who feared nothing, seemed to flinch away from him. Surely there was not his imagination. Then a few moments later, Lawrence arrived at a clear realization that he was smiling. Incidentally, if I really did think of a way to make a miracle happen, what would you do for me? It was surely the first time he had ever asked, what would you do for me? I'd give you my blessing. But even when intimidated, Elsa was a splendid clergywoman, so Lawrence kept some of his sudden self-admiration in reserve. What he had thought of was such a contemptible plan that he would have laughed off the very idea had it not been for her urging. When Lawrence and the others returned to Phylon's shop, there was no one inside. The door that led into the courtyard had been left open, and when Lawrence popped his head through and took a look around, he saw a temporary charcoal-fired stove in the middle of being set up. "Oh, you're back, are you? This'll take a bit of time, so you can wait inside." Whether he had been hired with corn or was simply an acquaintance, there was a cook-seeming fellow expertly skinning the eels, while around him apprentices stood expectantly. Lawrence nodded at Phylon and ducked back into the shop, where Elsa was watching him uncertainly. "You're the one who put me up to this, remember that," said Lawrence with mischief in his voice, at which Elsa's shoulders teased and tensed in a flinch. But her gaze was unwavering, and her lips tight. "I'm grateful, truly. I would have gotten old before thinking of such a thing on my own." Lawrence smiled and took a deep breath. His destination was the back of the shop. "In my father's letters," said Elsa suddenly to Lawrence's back, "he wrote to tell me to go my own way. In his books there were many stories of modest happiness born from compromise, but that no one had ever been truly satisfied with mere compromise, and..." She grasped the hand-carved seal around her neck and put on her own mischievous smile. "There were many stories where, even when failure came, it brought satisfaction with it. A business was built from success and failures, piled atop one another." Lawrence had known that for a very long time. "You're quite right," said Lawrence. And with long strides he headed down the hallway, deeper into Phylon's shop. It was well cleaned, and he could tell immediately that it received fresh air daily. Interesting that, despite the narrow hall and low ceiling at the back of the shop, it was brighter than the shop's front, where customers were received. But bright places were also places where voices carried well. After no time at all, he heard the happy voices of Hollow and Cole. The room had originally been a kitchen, but before the earthen floor that seemed to be lowered several times, there lay neatly folded the still smelly clothing of Hollow and Cole. Lawrence pulled aside the curtain that hung as a partition, appeared inside, and was immediately greeted by the back of a stark naked Cole, who, despite trying to escape Hollow, had been caught as she ladled hot water over him. "Aye, there you are. The water of Nayohita is 100 times hotter than this," she said appropriately enough. Of course, Cole had his own ladle to plunge into the basin, so he was giving as good as he got. When he noticed Lawrence, though, Cole hastily hid behind the basin. Hollow, meanwhile, looked at him as though a new prey animal had arrived. "If you play around like this, you're going to catch a cold here," said Lawrence, tossing large towels at the pair. He had long since finished actually bathing. Cole caught with his hand, Hollow with her head. "I've put each change of clothes at the door. Cole, yours are from Elsa, so make sure you to thank her." I will," said Cole brightly, then immediately sneezed. Hollow and Cole They were both completely naked. Cole dried himself off and hurried to put his clothes back on. You too, said Lawrence, at which Hollow sighed an unamused sigh, shaking her tail rapidly. Honestly, he said, I suppose no one saw you? Her tail wagging flung a shocking amount of water around, but her hair received different treatment. Hollow wrung it out with her hands, the water in it dripping to the floor. Just what sort of fool do you take me for? Achoo! When wet like this, her delicate body and pale, translucent skin were like a polished jewel of some kind, but her sneeze made her seem so silly, and combined with her body, she suddenly seemed very childlike. Lawrence sighed and went to help Hollow dry her hair. Is lunch prepared yet? They're making the stove now, just a bit longer. As the men at the dock said, they're best covered in olive oil and just roasted. Her hair was beautiful, but for all that beauty, it held a great deal of water. No matter how Lawrence brushed, there seemed to be no end to it. This sort of bathing isn't bad, but in Niuhita, you can have strong, snow-chilled wine brought to you. How about that, eh? Ola rambled on underneath the towel. She seemed a bit cold. Perhaps the water in the basin had mostly cooled. Certainly, and since everyone in the area does likewise, they all keep the prices good and high. Lawrence took the towel off her head and wrapped it around her shoulders. Ola brushed aside the hair that had fallen over her forehead. She replied. Come, my body's next, she said flirtatiously, putting her hand to her hip and looking up at him as though to say, how about it? If he flinched, the game would be over. He looked down into the amber eyes, so filled with challenge, then slowly closed his own. Hurry and dry yourself off and get dressed, he said. He could practically hear her cheeks puff out in irritation at Lawrence's failure to become flustered. Did her actions come from being simply unworried about the end of their journey, or was it an act put on precisely because of that approaching end? Lawrence did not know, but just as Hollow was talented as at such little performances, there was a little limit to how much Lawrence could hide. And what shall I do once I changed? I want to find Mr. Roy. Help me. Poor Leroy would be running all over town trying to buy provisions without any connections in the market, where everyone was hoarding for their own speculation, but Lawrence did not want to find any connections in the market where everyone was hoarding for their own speculation. I said the same thing, sorry guys. But Lawrence did not want to find him in order to extend him in any sort of helping hand. Although soon realized this, she gave Lawrence a searching look. For what purpose? Rivulets of water fell from her curves. The hot water had cooled, and it was cold in her room. Hollow's wet skin was rapidly cooling, and her eyes were even more icy than usual. There is a mercenary band, said Lawrence, close enough to Hollow that the droplets on her body threatened to wet him, too. As he looked down at her, near Yuitsu. What? They call themselves the Miyuri mercenaries. To his shocking words, Lawrence added still more shock. Mysteriously, though, it was in such times that one's mind became strangely clear. Find Mr. Leroy for me. I need to see him. Lawrence looked away and made as if business was done, but Hollow grabbed him by his lapel. Her face was beyond anger. What's your aim, then? I have a proposal for him. Hollow bared her fangs, and though the gaps between them hissed at a sort of sigh before that could gain enough mass to become an explosion, Lawrence put his hands on Hollow's left cheek. I'm not going to break any promises. He bent down so that he was even with her red-tinged amber eyes, those clear, beautiful eyes. I'm a merchant. I would never break a contract so easily. His words carried a twofold meaning. Lawrence stood. But I am going to propose a change in plans so far as circumstances allow, he added quietly. Do you? Hollow started, but her voice caught. She strengthened her grip on Lawrence's label as though to steady herself. Do you mean to say that you won't be going to Kishin? That depends. Lawrence was quite sure that it was his own conceited nature that made him think Hollow was about to cry. In truth, she was surely and deeply disgusted. Disgusted that this fool was up to one of his fool schemes again. Don't tell me that you're... Yes, jealous, said Lawrence lightly, returning Hollow's look. Of Miyuri, of course. Hollow was at a loss. She was so appalled and disappointed that Lawrence could practically hear it. Or is it Miyuri a woman? In which case, we can just laugh about this. He stared right at Hollow, who finally averted her gaze. Then slowly she shook her head. But come, Miyuri is not what you're thinking. But while you're reunited with him, I'll be alone on my wagon with my thoughts. To be frank, I hate that idea. He took Hollow's small hand in his and realized that it was quite cold. He took the towel that still hung around her shoulders and began to dry her face and neck with it. What will you do? She asked. Make it so that we don't have to go to Kishin. That's why I need to talk to Mr. Leroy right away. I ought to be able to save Cole and Elsa the trouble of going to Yuitsu as well. Lawrence might move the towel from Hollow's neck to her upper arm, but she brushed it off, annoyed. Can you do such a thing? No matter how perfectly elaborate his answer, if there was a single flaw in it, she would not miss it. Those keen, unforgiving eyes of her gaze at Lawrence. For some reason, Lawrence found himself smiling and replying with a self-deprecating tone. I hope to. This, he began, then realizing the reason for his smile. As a merchant, this is the only way I can turn and fight. Hollow drew her chin in, as though she had been taking a bite of something bitter. She looked up at Lawrence in disgust, as though to say, You're hopeless, you fool. And then she said it, You fool. Lawrence smiled and nodded cheerfully. If it doesn't work out, I'll give up. That's the truth. Hollow could tell when someone was lying. He looked to her as though to say, Tell me it isn't, at which she drew her chin down even further and made a grumbling sound. Hollow's gaze was an exceedingly dubious one. Lawrence cleared his throat and continued, Don't you think I've matured some? He had been beaten, kicked down, thrown away his life and his coin purse, all to protect Hollow, to follow her, to stay with her. If this was the result of all that, it had not been such a bad journey. Hollow neither laughed nor raged, and by now she seemed past even frustration or shock. She looked at Lawrence's smile and slumped, exhausted. And yet her face was very near to burying itself inside Lawrence's chest. You are a fool, she said quietly and laughed. She picked up the towel from where it had fallen and roughly wrapped it around her body. Truly, such a fool. Lawrence was fine being a fool. He watched Hollow roughly dry herself off, happily content to be a fool. It was just as Elsa had said. He felt so much better having decided to fight back. Hollow stepped out of the path of her feet pitter-pattering on the stone and earthen floor. She threw the towel at Lawrence. Her tail had just been washed, true, but in any case, it was fully fluffed. So, we have to find that meat bun now. Yes, honestly, you'd best hope we'd be back in time for lunch, declared Hollow, huffing a deep and irritated sigh. There was something distinctly animalistic about Leroy. Not in the way he looked, of course, but in the keenness of his senses. The bookseller was negotiating at a trade company's loading dock when he turned at the sound of Lawrence's footsteps, and the place was by no means quiet. It was noisy, with the shouts of men and neighs of horses, and all the din of everyday chatter. You've got a frightening look in your face, my friend, said Leroy, jokingly, and grinned. That's my line. Leroy's tone was even friendlier than usual, since he could see Hollow's form. If Hollow had not been there, the bookseller would have looked at Lawrence as an untrustworthy enemy. If you're looking for provisions, I've already managed to buy up quite a few. The right half of Leroy's face was distorted skillfully. He looked over his shoulder. Never mind then. he said shortly. The man with the trading company waved him off, as though already fed up with Leroy's attempts to force him to sell. Walking around with a lady companion and an expression like that, no merchant alive will trust you, said Leroy to Lawrence, as though they were just passing by each other. Lawrence's shoulders slumped. As I'm only too aware, he replied smoothly. So what business brings you here? Don't tell me you've gotten cold feet. In the world of credit and trust, sudden changes of heart were avoided above all else. Outright failure was far and away more preferable. No. Well, what then? Something's come up rather suddenly, I'm afraid. I won't be able to go to Chpt. They left the shop and walked alongside Leroy, making for a less crowded part of the street. They passed around a hollow, who let a bit of distance open between her and the two men before following. Are you mad? My companion asked me the same thing. Leroy clasped his mouth shut and glared at Lawrence. But there was confusion on his face. He could not grasp whatever it was Lawrence was thinking. Please, no games. I'm expecting 1,000 silver pieces in profit from this deal. He spoke as though he was a mercenary, boasting of having killed a bear with nothing but his fist. But that was not what Lawrence smiled at. He simply could not help but find it amusing that he was actually torn between his own pathetic jealousy and a deal of such size. You excuse me, but I won't be kicking aside an agreement we've already settled on. Leroy's face distorted in a grimace from one edge to the other. Lawrence lightly cleared his throat. The cold air tickled the inside of his cheeks. About the company in Chpt, it's a rather large one, with a special agreement with the Deling Company, correct? The Deling Company would not agree to provide only dark-skinned girls unless the customer was the highest quality, and a company able to make such demands would not be a small one. Still cautious and unable to see where Lawrence was going with all this, Leroy nodded slowly. Which means they must make a deal regularly with many companies. I'm not mistaken in thinking so, am I? I suppose not. But what of it? Leroy was obviously growing impatient, but Lawrence did not want to skip to the end of his explanation. He gulped and continued. If so, I ought to be able to remain in this town and still aid you in your purchase. The bookseller stopped in his tracks. The whole of his being working to anticipate what Lawrence was going to say next. Lawrence looked over his shoulder to follow him, so suddenly was Leroy stopped. The sun was just then low in the sky, so he squinted when he spoke. With money orders. Money orders? How? They're just a convenient way of moving money. Lawrence looked past Leroy's vast bulk to the idle hollow behind him. Not if we use them to harass. Lawrence faced toward and began walking away. Walking again, not walking away, sorry guys. Leroy was still confused, but Lawrence was confident he would follow. Mr. Lawrence, I have no idea what you're trying to say. Curiosity killed the cat. Once he knew, he would be unable to resist getting involved, no matter how dirty the trick. Lawrence turned back to Leroy. We'll issue multiple money orders to the company in question from many others. Huh? Each for maybe a few dozen silvers, or perhaps 100 or 200. Lawrence was impressed with the smile he managed. After all, the sort of brute force method he was describing was something only the wealthiest merchants could get away with. We'll change all the names and sell all the money orders at once. The company in Chpt will start cashing them without worrying about the strange coincidence, but as they start running low on coin, they'll begin to get suspicious. But it will already be too late. The coin will be gone from their coffers, and the money changers will catch wind of this and hike up their exchange rates. And what will the company do then? The money orders will keep coming in, including ones from their regular customers. Which ones are the malicious ones and which one are the partners they can't afford to anger? And in the midst of all this, customers and trading partners keep coming. Buy this, buy that, pay what you said you'd pay. The company will be a mess. The fat Leroy's smooth skin normally looked like flour-dusted dough, but now it was as white as if it had been carved from rock salt. And that's where you come in. You seem to be in trouble, so I'll take these money orders off your hand, but there's a condition, you say. And of course, all the money orders Leroy would be taking charge of would be from the Deling Company, so there would be no need for Leroy to actually have the coin. At that point, the outcome would be simple. It all depended on Leroy's nerve and talent. And then that's where I'd tell them I heard they have a certain volume in their possession. Exactly, said Lawrence with a wide smile. Every bit the clever merchant hawking his wares, said Leroy, could hardly be blamed for looking at him aghast, as though he considered Lawrence unworthy of the name merchant for thinking of such a despicable tactic. But as a plan, it was sound. There were, of course, some flaws. I understand what you're proposing, but is the Deling Company willing? Leroy was not worried about the damage to their credit. The Deling Company would bring in several other large companies in Lenos and send the money orders to them, and at that point their own names would be clean as a whistle. The problem was that a large amount of coin would be necessary to issue the money orders. They will be, after all. Coin is awfully valuable in Lenos right now. Leroy raised his voice. The Deling Company would be able to make a tidy profit on the exchange rate. So long as there's a difference between the currency markets of Lenos and Chpt, there's a profit to be had. And fortunately for us, the value of coin in Lenos is clearly much stronger. So I'll show you the figures. There was a smack sound as Leroy's hand hit his head. He groaned, but his eyes had a calculating, contemplative look in them. Given a plan Lawrence had proposed, the Deling Company agreed. In that moment, Leroy's acquisition of the book was assured. There would be no need for him to spend the duration of the journey to Chpt agonizing over the uncertain future and how to exploit this or that weakness in order to get them to sell the book. No merchant who plowed the lonely road alone could underestimate such peace of mind. Leroy himself had change his own plans after hauling a load of scriptures into Lenos. Such mishaps happened all too easily, and were likewise easily imagined. But with this plan, Leroy could head out on his journey with real uncertainty. With real certainty. He looked at Lawrence like a true believer seeking to confess. Are you serious about this? He was hooked. Lawrence's answer was short. Of course. The bookseller nodded a mute and defeated nod. They immediately headed for the Deling Company when there was a change in plans. It was the best to declare them quickly, yet when preparing for a hard right turn in a swift-moving wagon, it was best to at least lay one's body over the load. Lawrence had naturally considered this and had been careful not to underestimate the company, which was why he had again brought Holo to the Deling Company. This was to prove to them his resolve, for once before he had left her there for money, only to throw the money in their faces and take her back. When they arrived at their destination, it seemed the company four masters were in the meeting together. When he had led into this room, they all came in to meet him. There would be no turning back now. He could not let himself regret not making every possible effort, doing everything he could do. The job of explaining had passed from Leroy to Lawrence. The forcible use of money orders was more important to him, as he was avoiding the trip to Chpt. As they listened, none of the three men, Erdogan included, twitched so much as an eyebrow. Far from it. When he was finished listening, with his hands still folded upon the table, Erdogan said only just, "Well, shall we take this route?" It was Lawrence who now disbelieved his ears. Despite being the one to propose the plan, he replied without thinking, "Truly?" Erdogan made a deliberately surprised face, as though to say, "Are you not the one who proposed this?" Of course, this was my proposal, and if you agreed upon it, I'm deeply grateful, but in addition, there's one more favor I'd like to ask. I'd assume you yourself do not wish to go to Chpt, Mr. Lawrence." Of course, there had been the inquiry from Phylon earlier, and now Holo was with him in person. It did not take particular clever person to put the pieces together. Imogen chuckled. You may be the one to have proposed this method, Mr. Lawrence, but it's still quite consistent with our requirements. And if you're willing to do this, we've no reason to refuse. After all, we've considered it ourselves. What? Lawrence was not the only one whose face came up in surprise. Leroy was stunned. However, no reasonable mind would come up with such a abusive technique, so even if someone did think of it, they would hardly propose it to us, or so we had concluded, much less suggest it to you. You'd be instantly suspicious. It was not at all clear whether Imogen was teasing or not, but from the ironic twist at the corner of his mouth, Lawrence decided he was telling the truth. But you've accumulated a bit too much age and experience to consider such crude, reckless things, am I wrong? Hollow was the only one at the table to laugh at Imogen's words. The slave trader faced her and smiled pleasantly. There aren't many ways for a man to stay young. Your companion there was an excellent decision. I mean, no offense, am I being quite sincere? He looked straight at Lawrence. Lawrence did not know how to answer, but he knew enough to politely accept the words as given. I dare say I understood the moment I saw your companion. 2 heads are better than 1, they say. There's wisdom in that. Though we have 4 heads, added one of them the other masters. Evidently, there were limits to how far even a man like Imogen could go alone. We therefore agreed to your proposal. I trust you don't mind us handling the details. It was said in like a business-like tone, to which Lawrence and Leroy both quickly replied. Only the Lane Company understood the connections between companies and preparation of coin necessary for this, and given the underhanded tactics they were using, even if the book was safely obtained, it would be difficult to carry it out of the town. Lawrence and Leroy would be leaving all those myriad details to the Lane Company, and in exchange, they would be playing the villains. That was undoubtedly why Imogen himself had not proposed the possibility to them. It would be good business, I dare say. Though one does have to feel bad for the targeted company. Imogen sounded genuinely sympathetic rather than simply saying the words because he thought he ought to. They all stood and shook hands and thus sealed the new agreement. For the men of the Deline Company, the shaking of hands came before the signing of the contract, for truly their business was closer to Philon's world than anything else. Now that may God grant us success. With those words, the meeting was closed. Leroy looked to Lawrence and strayed smile on his face. We've really done it now, he seemed to say. Lawrence found himself wanting to echo the sentiment with this. He no longer had to go to Chpt, and Leroy alone would take on the role of the villain, and the price would have to be paid. About the fee you promised, said Lawrence as they exited the room into the hallway, so quiet it seemed to swallow sound. Oh, please not now. Later then. No, that's not what I mean, said Leroy, taking a quick look around. Imogen was still conferring with his colleagues in the meeting room and had yet to emerge. A short distance away, there was a single smart-looking boy standing next to the door he had just closed. But we can talk about that once everything else is finished, can't we? Said Leroy, looking up at Lawrence mischievously. I will be playing the villain here, but we know they're going to surrender immediately. I could never content myself if I skip paying the introduction fee on such an outrageous scheme, and more than anything else, I may not be Mr. Philon, Leroy said, smiling an innocent, boyish smile, but I want you to owe me a bit of a favor, eh? Are you truly a traveling merchant? I'm having a hard time believing it. Back when he had spent his days with his eyes on the ground, hopping to a spot of single copper coin, Lawrence had longed to hear such words. It was a bitter irony that now that he had discovered something he valued above gold, he was hearing it all the time. Before he answered, he glanced at Hollow, who seemed to be keeping a bit of a distance, perhaps to avoid interfering with their conversation. I'm quite a failure as a traveling merchant, I should say, so you're not wrong about that. Leroy grinned, but there was not so much as a trace of a smile from Hollow. Perhaps that was because of her own plan had been so quickly kicked aside, or perhaps it was the revelation of Lawrence's jealousy of her packmate in Yuitsu. But she did not seem angry so much as utterly at a loss. He was certain that if he asked her if this was so, he would receive an affirmative answer via her thrown fist. But still, Mr. Lawrence, worry yourself not. Forcing people to do something they loathe with a smile on my face is my nature, said Leroy. Frustratingly, it was these words that Hollow finally smiled at her under her hood. Leroy had been doing just that when they had first met him at Phylon's shop. Prick an opponent's conscience, and one could make them do whatever they wished. So this sort of thing is right in my wheelhouse, and the bigger the prey, the greater the feeling of accomplishment, eh? Elsa had been exactly right about Leroy. his avarice made him trustworthy. Lawrence nodded. I look forward to seeing your results, he replied, and left it at that. End of chapter 4.